So, what, tomorrow? Yeah. It's already Saturday?
Days go fast.
This week has just been blurry.
That's what I did at camp when the kids were asking me to do something. That was like Thursday.
Oh, nice.
I think that was Thursday.
Just a little double.
A little
But
bit.
it impressed the kids
Fast.
really good.
Oh, of course, kids love doubles.
Yeah.
Did Steve learn to cork?
Nope. He gave Ryan $1. Actually, he gave Ryan a Gatorade instead.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, time for us to kind of get rolling.
And so he minused himself a
We're
Gatorade.
recording.
Huh?
We're recording.
I'm going to ask you ladies to pause just a minute in there, and we're going to prayer together.
I don't think they can hear you.
No, they can't hear because of the divider.
Hey, you all ladies.
They heard.
I heard it. Okay, guys, we're going to have a word of prayer together, okay? All right, so let's bow our heads. Okay, Father, we want to thank you so much for bringing us all here safely this morning, and we want to thank you for the beautiful day that you've given us. We ask that we would receive the blessing you have stored up for us. Also, we want to ask, Lord, that you would be with all those who are tuning in online, and that they might as well be blessed as a result of our time together. We thank you for watching over us throughout the week, providing many blessings, many challenges. It was a busy week for a lot of folks. We pray, Lord, that you had used us to impress someone during that time for you. We ask as we open your word today that your words would find real meaning in our hearts, and that we would be better prepared for the events to soon take place. We ask, Lord, that you also watch over those who are on our prayer list. You know all the needs, all the concerns. We trust, Lord, to put them in your hands and know that you have their best interest at heart. We're looking for your soon return, and we ask that you prepare us for that time through study of your word and your inspiration through your Spirit. So guide and direct us, Lord, to this end. We ask it all in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen and amen. Okay. Well, good to have you guys joining us online. We're glad that you're tuning in again. We were looking at the stats here earlier, and we've been, I think we were watched this month so far in a couple of different countries, 30 different states. And so we're glad that wherever you might be, whatever you're doing, that you're finding your way to join us. We do a simple thing here, homechurch.us. We just have a little inspirational story after prayer, and then we get into God's Word, talking about the insight there. It's pretty simple. And we invite others to do the very same if you can. We're hoping to reach a group of people that are called the Duns, particularly. They're done with the traditional form of church, and we're just trusting that God will guide and direct whatever.
Not just done with the traditional form, we're done with the politics and
Yeah,
all of the red tape that goes with it.
So anyway, people get frustrated for one reason or another, but we're just trusting that the Lord will continue to work through them, through His Spirit. And so it's story time, and we're about chapter 16 or so
16
in
or so.
Peretti's book on spiritual warfare. And so tune in.
Nathan and Armith flew high above the beautiful summer countryside, following the speeding Buick. Things were definitely quieter out here, away from strife-torn Ashton. But still neither one felt entirely comfortable about the two passengers in the car below. Although the heavenly escorts weren't yet certain, they had a feeling that a covert plot on the part of Rafar and his guerrillas might be underway. Marshall and his good-looking young reporter were too critical of a combination for those demons to pass up. Former college dean Eldon Strachan lived on a quaint and unpretentious 10-acre farm an hour away. He was not farming the place, just living there. And as Marshall and Bernice drove up the long gravel driveway, they could tell his interest extended no further than the immediate yard of the white farmhouse. The lawn was small and manicured, and the fruit trees were pruned and barren. The flower beds were soft with freshly turned and weeded soil. A few chickens meandered about, pecking and scratching, and a collie greeted them with furious barking. Wow, a normal human being to interview for once, said Marshall. Well, that's why he moved out of Ashton, said Bernice. Strachan stepped onto his porch as the collie ran and barked beside him. Hi there, he called to Marshall and Bernice as they got out of the car. Quiet down now, lady, he added to the collie, but Lady never obeyed such commands. Strachan was a healthy, white-haired fellow who got plenty of exercise on this place and showed it. He wore work clothes and still carried a pair of garden gloves in his hand. Marshall extended his hand for a good firm handshake, and so did Bernice. They exchanged their introductions, and Strachan invited them around the barking lady and into the house. Doris, Strachan called. Mr. Hogan and Miss Kruger are here. Within minutes, Doris, a sweet, rotund little grandma type, had set the coffee table with tea, coffee, rolls, and goodies, and they were having a pleasant conversation about the farm, the countryside, the weather, and the neighbor's wandering cow. They all knew it was obligatory, and besides, the Strachans were very pleasant people to talk with. But finally, Eldon Strachan introduced the transitional sentence. Yes, I suppose things in Ashton aren't quite this nice. Bernice got out her notepad as Marshall said, Yeah, and I kind of hate to drag it all out here with us. Strachan smiled and said philosophically, You can run, but you can't hide. He looked out the window at the trees, backed by an endless blue sky, and said, I have always wondered if just leaving it all was the right thing, but what else could I do? Marshall double-checked his notes. Let's see now. You told me on the telephone when you left, in June, about a year ago, and Ralph Kuklinski took your place? And he's still there, I understand. Yeah, he's still there. Was he in on any of this inner circle stuff? I don't know what else to call it. Strachan thought for a moment. I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was. He really had to be one of the group to be put in as dean. So there really is some kind of in-group, so to speak? Absolutely. That became pretty obvious after a while. All the regents were becoming like peas in a pod, like clones of each other. They all acted the same, talked the same, except for you. Strachan laughed a little. I guess I just didn't fit into the club very well. As a matter of fact, I became a definite outsider, even an enemy. I think that's why they fired me. So I suppose you're talking about that fracas over the college funds? Exactly. I never suspected anything until we started having some unexplained disbursement delays. Our bills were being paid late, our payrolls were behind, and it wasn't even my job to be hounding after that sort of thing. But when I started getting some indirect complaints, hearing others talking about it, I asked Baylor what the problem was. He never directly answered my questions, or at least I didn't like the sound of his answers. That's when I called in an independent accountant, a friend of a friend, to look into it and maybe do some quick scanning of what the accounting office was doing. I don't know how he ever got access to the information, but he was a clever character and found a way. And Bernice was ready with a question. Can we have his name? Strachan answered with a shrug. Ernie Johnson. How do we reach him? Well, I'm afraid he's dead. And that was a letdown. So Marshall grabbed at a hope. Did he leave you any records, anything written down? Strachan only shook his head. If he did, those records were lost. Why do you think I've been sitting out here so quietly? Listen, I even know Norm Manley, the state attorney general, pretty well. And I thought of going to him and telling him what was going on. But let's face it, those big folks at the top don't give you the time of day unless you have some really substantial proof. It's tough to get the authorities to stick their necks out. They just won't do it. All right, so what was it that Ernie Johnson found? He came back horrified. According to his findings, monies from grants and tuitions were being reinvested at an alarming rate, but apparently there were no dividends or returns of any kind from whatever the investments were, as if the money had been poured down a bottomless well somewhere. The figures had been juggled to cover it up. Accounts payable was staggered so that other accounts could be dipped into to pay those. It was one colossal mess. A mess worth millions? Oh, at least. The college money had been leaking out in large amounts for years, with no clues as to where it was going. Somewhere out there was a money-hungry monster gobbling up all the college's assets. And that's when you called for the audit? and Eugene Baylor hit the ceiling. The whole thing went from professional to personal in an instant, and we became intense enemies. And that convinced me all the more that the college was in big trouble and that Baylor had a lot to do with it. But of course, there's nothing Baylor does that all the others don't know about. I'm sure they're all aware of the problem, and it's my feeling that their unanimous vote for my resignation was a common conspiracy. But to what end, asked Bernice. Why would they want to undermine the college financial base? Strachan shook his head. I don't know what they're trying to do, but unless there's something else hidden somewhere to explain where those funds are going and how the losses are going to be made up, that college is most certainly headed for bankruptcy. Kuklinski must know that. And as far as I know, he was in total agreement with the financial policies with my resignation. So Marshall flipped to some other notes. So just how does our kind Professor Langstratt figure into all this? Strachan had to chuckle. The dear professor. She was definitely a definite influence and mentor, to be sure, but I don't think she's the ultimate center of things. It seemed to me she had a lot to do with controlling the group, while someone higher up had a lot to do with controlling her. I think she's answering to someone, some unseen authority. But you've no idea who? Strachan just shook his head. So what else do you know about her? He searched his memory. A graduate of UCLA, she's taught at other universities before she came to Whitmore. She's been on the faculty at least 6 years. I do recall she always had a strong interest in Eastern philosophy and occultism. She was once involved in some kind of neo-pagan religious group in California. But you know, I never realized until maybe 3 years ago that she was openly declaring her beliefs to her classes, and I was rather surprised to find her teachings aroused a lot of interest. Her beliefs and practices were not only spreading among the students, but also among the faculty. Well, who on the faculty? Marshall asked. Strachan shook his head in disgust. It started years before I was aware of it, in the psychology department, among Langstratt's associates. Margaret Islander, you may know of her. I believe my friend Ruth Williams does, said Bernice. I think she was the first to be initiated into Langstratt's group, but she'd always had an interest in psychics like Edgar Cayce, so she was a natural. Anyone else? Well, he pulled out a hastily scrawled list to let Marshall look at. I've gone over and over this in the months since I left. Here's a list of most of the psychology department, and he pointed out a few names. Trevor Corcoran is new on the staff this year. He even studied in India before he came here to teach. Juanita Janke replaced Kevin Ford. Well, as a matter of fact, a lot of people were replaced over the past few years. We had a whole lot of turnover. So Marshall noted another portion of the list. Who are these people? The humanities department and then the philosophy department. And these down here are in the biology and pre-med programs. A lot of them are new as well. We had a lot of turnover. That's the second time you've said that, Bernice observed. Strachan stared at her. What are you thinking? Bernice took the list from Marshall and placed it in front of Strachan again. Well, tell us now, how many of these people have come on staff during the last 6 years, during the time Langstratt's been there? He took a second, more critical look at the list. Jones, Conrad, Witherspoon, Epps. An overwhelming percentage of the names were those of new faculty members who had replaced former members who had resigned or whose contracts simply had not been renewed. Well, isn't that odd, he said. I would say that's odd, Bernice agreed. Strachan was visibly shaken. All the turnover. I was getting very concerned about it, but I never even considered. Well, this would explain a lot of things. I knew there was some kind of common interest spreading among all these people. They seemed to have a very unique and undefinable rapport with each other, like their own lingo, their own inside secrets, their own ideas of reality. And it seemed no one person could do anything without everyone else knowing about it. I thought it was a fad, a sociological phase. But he looked up with a new awareness in his eyes. So it was more than that. Our campus was invaded and our faculty displaced by a madness. And for just a moment, Marshall had a flashback, a quick, fleeting memory of his daughter, Sandy, saying, "People around here are starting to act weird. I think we're being invaded by aliens." And that memory was immediately followed by Kate's voice over the phone. I'm concerned about Sandy. She just isn't the same old Sandy anymore. Marshall snapped out of it and began leafing through his materials and found the old list Bernice had gotten from Albert Darr. All right, what about these classes Langstrat was teaching? Introduction to the God and Goddess consciousness and the craft, the sacred medicine wheel, spells and rituals, pathways to your inner light, meet your own spiritual guides. Strachan nodded with recognition. It all began as part of an alternative education program, purely a voluntary thing for any interested students and paid for by special tuitions. I thought it was just a study of folklore, myths, and traditions. But I guess they were taking this stuff pretty seriously. So it seems, and now we have a great percentage of the staff and student body bewitched. Including the regents? Strachan did some fresh thinking. Well, get ready for this. I think the same kind of upheaval happened on the Board of Regents as well. There are 12 regent positions altogether, and 5, I think, have been suddenly and abruptly replaced in the last year and a half. How else could the vote for my resignation be unanimous? I used to have some very loyal friends on that board. Well, what are their names and where have they gone? And Bernice started writing the names down as he recalled them, along with any other information he could provide. And that, said Strachan, takes care of just about everyone. There are none left but initiates into this strange mystical group. And I'll leave it right there so we can... There's more conversation that goes on, but it probably takes several minutes to get through.
Yeah, that chapter kind of, he's flip-flopping back and forth between the dialogue between the demons and then the people involved.
Well, he's not talking about the demons at all. They're just talking about the people.
Yeah, in this chapter they were.
Right.
But I'm just saying the previous chapter it was the
Right.
demons' interaction. So he's flip-flopping back and forth between their
Right.
dialogue and then this dialogue.
It's like a screenplay.
Yeah. You know, the Bible says that God gives his angels charge over us. And so if we didn't have that, we'd be at the mercy of a lot of the demonic influence. My question was, is there demonic, has there been just like we have people call it a guardian angel, is there a demon associated with trying to harass everybody as well, you think?
I would imagine so. I mean, if we're approaching the end of time, Satan's going to double his efforts.
Yeah.
But I think that it's wise to consider that the things that we see happening around us, we see things in the political arena. I mean, the stuff that's happening in the news doesn't make sense. There are people advocating things that, to those of us that are normal, rational people, we think, how could anybody say this with a straight face? How could they believe this? It's like you've got a whole segment of people.
Well, as I was listening to the chapter there, you know, you were talking about different people in different positions and so forth, and that got me thinking that no matter what position you're in, you're going to be part of the controversy. There's nobody that's kind of sitting on the sideline just watching it happen. Everybody is a target.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we have good angels, the loyal angels, watching over us and helping us. And unfortunately, we have the demonic angels that are trying to cause problems. And so that's where the controversy lies, you know.
The interesting part is that God has his angels stationed to see what's happening, to try to head things off. We don't recognize that kind of thing going on. But sometimes you get a feeling after you see certain things happen or you see certain decisions being made, and then you begin to trace it back. And you find out that this person has connections with a particular train of thought or Jesuit philosophy or something of that nature. You know, we wondered how this spiritual formation stuff had taken such a hold in the different churches. And we thought, you know, well, we're far removed from the conference. We're just this little bitty church down here with a handful of members. Nobody bother us because we're out of the way and not important. And we were very surprised when a pastor came in, was sent down here, who began promoting that very thing. You know, we thought we were small potatoes. Nobody would care. The devil didn't care about what was happening in little Southwest Virginia. And we found out it was very, very much alive and well and working behind the scenes. It was just kind of a surprise. You know, you feel like you're in a secluded place where you're kind of insulated from all that most of that happens in the cities and the universities, and where you understand those things are stirred up all the time.
And that was even more confirmed when we went to Wyoming and I spoke out there at a church.
Right.
And they only had like 10 members in this church. It was,
Yeah, the churches out there had like 10 pastors, one pastor for 10 churches, and each church only had 5, 6 members attending. I mean, little tiny churches.
And still, they were pushing the spiritual
The
formation.
conference was pushing spiritual formation in those churches.
Yeah.
And I thought,
Absolutely,
nobody
yeah.
saw the danger. Because it came from the conference leadership. It must be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're always quick to bring out Ellen White and be like, oh, you need to support the church.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll pick that up next week if we want to continue with that. It is an important subject, so we'll see where we want to go with that, or if we want to maybe do some other
Quit
things as well.
flip-flopping, we're just going to go with it.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, anyway, we want to continue with Elijah's study on marriage and the importance of that. And so I'll let him take the captain's chair.
You can sit right there.
Okay.
We can all stay where we are. There's no captain's chair.
Captain's chair, go ahead.
You don't have your movable throne anymore that rocks back and forth.
Yeah.
He started out with a little footstool with a cushion on it, and it rocked. So that was the first captain's chair that we had.
Yeah.
Squeaked a lot.
Yeah, everything squeaks a little bit. So Simeon had pointed this out last week, but I mean, our studies have kind of been transitioning from the topic of marriage into specific roles in general of women and men
And family.
and family. And I think last week we had talked about discussing more the roles of a woman, of a wife. So I think if we just kind of pick apart some verses and
Did you say roles or rules?
roles.
Some men would prefer there were rules, right?
Well, I think we both have rules to abide by to some degree. I mean, I don't know whether what these would be considered guidelines or basically just what God says, here's what works the best for these current situations.
Well, there's a difference between a rule and a principle.
Mm-hmm.
A principle is a foundational idea that allows you to kind of work it within your framework, you know. The principle, for example, in dress that's given in Scripture is modesty. Well, that varies from one person to another. It varies from one culture to another. In some cultures, the modesty includes all the way down to the ankles. And, you know, and then in the Bible times, a woman would have been considered immodest to have exposed her legs.
Her hair.
And yet we go back into other cultures and other times, and they exposed all kinds of things.
Well, they still do today in parts of Africa. You know, women walk around topless in certain parts. You know.
But when you learn the principle is modesty, then you let the Lord guide you as to what you're putting on, whether you feel it's modest or not. And nobody's going to tell you what color to wear or what style. Or there were some who advocated a reform dress in the church. And if you ever saw any of those, they were some of the most hideous looking things ever contrived.
During Ellen White's time, I guess.
Can you imagine?
Well, there were some people, it really, in her day, it was a rather revolutionary idea, but it was very modest because the skirts they wore had hoops in them. And when they leaned forward, the hoops would go up in the back. And of course, they were long enough that they dragged on the ground. And in those days, the horses were used for transportation. So when you walked, all of the excrement from the horses and people spitting and everything dragged onto your clothing and onto your skin. And she said it was unhealthy. So she advocated a shorter skirt with pants under it. That way it was constantly modest.
She was
You
ahead
could
of her
work in
time.
the yard, in the garden, or whatever, and always be modest. Well, there were some people in the 1960s who looked at that drawing of the original reform dress that was designed in the 1800s and said, and Sister White had written, this is the reform dress that God showed me, and this was the pattern. So they thought we needed to take that pattern in that style from the 1800s, and that is what every woman had to wear. Needless to say, it didn't go over really well. And in fact, the original reform dress didn't. The women didn't like wearing it. They had so much opposition, they finally dropped it. But you see that the principle there was covering yourself modestly and being practical so that you could do your day-to-day things, getting in and out of a carriage modestly, bending over modestly. Those things were all important. The principle was there, but people began to try to develop rules. You know, no more than this inch, no so many inches from the floor, no more than so many inches wide. You know, they had all of those little rules they put in there.
Just like the Pharisees, right?
Right. And the same thing has happened with the roles of women,
Yeah.
which is where we get the expression the rule of thumb.
Rule of thumb.
Yep. When someone says the rule of thumb is that you do this, the rule of thumb comes from a legal principle that at some point the courts had decreed that the rod a man would beat his wife with could be no thicker than his thumb. That's where we get that expression.
It's just the rule of thumb.
Yes, the rule of thumb.
It's like a switch.
Couldn't
Okay.
hit her with anything bigger than that. Aren't you men really happy with that idea?
So he's out there measuring in the yard, like.
Court has ruled us so.
Exactly. But you know, people can get crazy when they want to.
Control.
Instead of the rule that you couldn't beat your wife at all, you know.
Right.
Well, we got to keep these women in line, you know.
All right, so we'll go to the part of scripture which everybody probably references when thinking of finding a godly wife or stuff like that.
Psalms.
Proverbs.
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 I mean, probably Psalms too, but I don't think David talks too much about godly women.
31. Yeah.
He kind of had an issue.
He's
with
like,
women.
well, which one of my wives was no? But so this is at least the one that I think is probably the most common one for people to go to, and it kind of raises a standard for a woman that is super high above most women, which is, you know, kind of the, like I said, I think almost more like the goal, not necessarily the exact one you'd find, because I don't think anybody would ever marry anyone if this was the exact type of woman you were looking for. Starting from verse 10.
It's Proverbs what?
Proverbs 31. Cool. It says there in the first couple of verses.
Of course, you know this is an acrostic, right?
An acrostic.
Right. This is where each verse jumps off from a Hebrew letter. It's a poem.
Mhm.
So you know you have Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, you know, that kind of thing. So you're that's where the verses are going. That's why it sounds a little unrealistic.
It's because it's
It's-
literally
it's
just
a
something
poem.
that kind of goes together.
It's a
in
It's
poem.
like the ABC song.
Yeah.
A is for absolutely the best wife you can find.
Yeah, B. Right.
B is for the best cook.
yeah.
Right. So.
Well, B and C for the best cook.
Yeah, I gotta go knock two
I
out.
wonder
It's
how that
interesting.
translates, if there's an actual translation of what that breaks down to in the acrostic from Hebrew and how it impacts the verses.
That would be interesting to look into. I was mostly just reading it for what it is at the moment, but we can talk more about that as we go if anybody has any insights they'd like to share as we read. So starting from verse 10, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her.
In my translation says her worth, not her price, but her worth is far above rubies. It's a little different connotation there.
That's true. There are certain aspects of the King James which sometimes can sound a bit more possessive. Like it makes her sound like an object that could be traded or
Yeah.
like a good. But I think when you understand Old English for what it is, it's easier to understand the idea, because it's more like the root word of a thing than it is like how we understand it today.
Even still, he's just saying her price is priceless. So
Far
we're-
above
her value.
rubies.
Yeah,
Her
we're
value is
A
far
virtuous
above-
Regardless,
woman
yeah,
is
he's-
priceless. Let's just put it in
He's
modern
He's just
English.
saying she's worth a lot.
Worth a lot.
So what is a virtuous woman? Or well, virtuous, I should say, because we all know what a woman is.
Do we really? Okay.
Women know what women are, I guess.
Men are still mystified. Maybe that picture was circulating on Facebook that said they now came up with a manual that explains women. It's a book about this thick. And that's only volume 1.
It's probably a picture of the healthcare bill that was passed years ago.
Right.
So what is virtuous? Anybody know?
Did the boys go outside?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
She said that it's a woman of character, spiritual force, and individuality. Oh, ability.
That's a good one.
Call up to the house.
Any other thoughts to that?
This just has a reference here. It says term used of power, wealth, and status.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Was the root word, because like in English, virtue, that is what virtue means. Is
Character.
somebody of character, someone who is virtuous, full of virtue,
Integrity.
integrity.
Right.
But the root word is, which I mean could still be derived from the idea of virtue, someone of character. But strength, might, efficiency, wealth. It's another word for like army. So a woman of strength, would be another way of translating that. Which, like I said, I think character comes from that as well. But I kind of like the idea that it's talking more just about not even just a woman who's full of good virtues, but a woman who is strong. Which I think there's slight differences in.
And of course, the wealth could mean a wealth of character development. I mean, it doesn't have to mean
She's
material
wealth.
things.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
probably in this case, it means more of that. It means a wealth of common sense. How about that?
Well, and I think it also stands to reason that would be applicable because the next part of that verse is that her price is far above, or her value is far above.
Proverbs also has a lot to do with like the analogy of like wisdom being a woman. So, talking about how understanding is a big thing in Proverbs too.
You mean Lux?
Well, wisdom usually is associated with people that are older or mature.
Yeah, but in Proverbs it talks about getting understanding to find her wisdom, to find wisdom. And it describes her as a girl. Or describes her
No,
as a
same
woman.
with the church. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean all women are.
No, I know, but I mean like that's what I'm saying. Like Proverbs uses that analogy a lot as like wisdom being a woman.
Yeah.
How
And
people
so-
find her.
And the fact that her husband says safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. That's how this up here in the New King James. No lack of gain.
Yeah. So what does that mean?
I think it shows a sign of not only perception but intuition. In other words, what do I need to do to satisfy any interest that my husband would have? So there's an intuition that comes with that.
But so he safely trusts in her, so he shall have no need of gain.
Right.
Another way I view that particular passage, I think, is relating also to how the home is managed. That there is a trust that he will have in a woman like this, of the things that are put into her hands, in terms of managing the household or managing, money or whatever the case may be. That he has confidence in her ability to do these things. Sorry. Give me the funny look. Okay, so moving on there from verse 11, go to verse 12. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ships. She brings her food from afar. She rises also while it is yet night and gives meat to her household and a portion to her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She girds her loins with strength and strengthens her arms. And some things that I think are interesting to unpack in this little section here. What are some things that you guys kind of are seeing there?
This is talking about you, ladies.
Yeah.
I mean,
What are the things you girls say about these verses?
yeah. But again, this is the ideal, right? This is.
I haven't seen Elsa seek wool and flax yet, so.
Yeah.
Well, we were reading about it today. Women are weaker. Our muscles are not as strong as men.
That means you just have to work twice as long and hard.
I think I'd heard somebody putting out the statistic that, like, in terms of men and women, like a man and a woman of the same exact weight, like they said that men have like 15 to 25% more muscle than women on average when it comes to people of the exact same weight. Basically,
They're built for different purposes.
they're both 150
Right.
pounds. The man is 15 to 25% more muscle than she is.
Yeah, well, obviously, like your mom was saying, there's a different purpose,
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
roles.
Yeah, when God created man and woman, he created them male and female, and then his next command after he put them together was be fruitful and multiply. So obviously the woman was built for the handling the multiplying part, and the man was built for the providing part.
Fruitful part.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. So.
But these verses that you just read here, this shows a woman that, like I said, it has.
She's
shows
not a doormat.
Not a doormat. She shows initiative. She shows perspective.
Smart.
She obviously has the abilities, but the whole time she's thinking, what's best for my family? How can I bring joy and happiness and comfort to my family? And that's what all this is about.
I think the worst thing that the enemy has done in today's society is blurring the roles between men and women, trying to make us believe that men and women are the same and that there should be this androgynous approach that men and women are interchangeable as though they're exactly the same. And it's just such a perversion of what God created.
Not only that, but what you see in these verses here, you see somebody that's willing to go the extra mile, not being told what to do and how to do, but just takes the initiative to do it. But she's doing it for her family, she's doing it for her husband, and not necessarily herself. I mean, today, I think in today's culture, you have women that are obviously very talented, have tremendous abilities, highly educated. When women have initiative, they have perspective, but they're saying, I want to do all this for myself, and not not necessarily anybody else. So there's a difference. I think there's a selflessness here that's really coming through.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge overall theme.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of selflessness, self-sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, to get up in the middle of the night to prepare
Feed her
meals, to
family.
go and I'm almost like she's a businesswoman, taking the initiative to go out and find things, for the family, etc. It's like she had Facebook, and the internet. That she's always searching, looking, trying to find things, etc.
Opportunistic, so
My
to
mom
speak.
was saying here that it seems like she's working more than her servants.
Right.
Well, to some extent, she
setting a
would.
good example for
I mean,
sure.
if you were to say that the man is the head of the household and the woman is the heart of the household or the home, she is looking at everything she does with an eye to showing love for her family and to nurturing and what's best to bringing them all together. Whereas the husband is providing the income and looking after the physical needs of the whole family as a whole. It's a
He's making
partnership.
Sure she has everything she needs.
It's a partnership where they each complement each other. They fill in the gaps between each other. To think that they should both be the same and do exactly the same things is unfair, for one, because most men are not built and not designed mentally for the nurturing and the tenderness and the self-sacrificing that it takes to raise a baby. It's just not innate. There are some men out there that can do it, but by and large, men don't have the neurological makeup to be strong nurturers. And that's not bad. They're not meant to be. Men are meant to be the providers and the leaders and the global decision makers, which is perfect, you know. We can each fulfill our own purpose within that and be a blessing in the community and in our homes.
Yeah.
And everything runs. It's kind of like saying, you know, the women's feminist movement would have you believe that every corporation needs two bosses, that the man and the woman have to be co-equal bosses. And that, you know, you see this whole paradigm shift in society where women are no longer downtrodden. Yeah, there was a time in society where women were looked down on. And in some cases, they were not, the women interpreted as being looked down on, but in many cases, it was men protecting the women. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, this idea that men should be courteous and show special courtesies to the women, there's nothing wrong with that. Why would that be an evil thing? And yet some women in the feminist movement said, oh, that was terrible, that men shouldn't hold the door for a woman and, you know, shouldn't show those courtesies. Yeah. It's just strange that we're at this place where everything's become gray and ugly. You know, whereas before you had these colors, you had these, you know, they're different. There's nothing wrong with differences. The differences are there for a wonderful purpose.
Yeah. I mean, even on just a simple level of thinking, you know, that men aren't designed to be the nurturing type, so to speak. You know, like we are designed for critical thinking in different directions.
Right.
You know, we're designed to be able to separate ourselves emotionally to make choices.
Exactly.
So, I mean, yeah.
I think verse 16 is talking too about the fact that even though she's married, maybe has a family, she's also an individual. You know, she considers a field and buys it, and from her profits she plants a vineyard. I mean, there's a real ability to, there's forward thinking here. She understands the process of economy and profit and loss, and the idea of, you know, how to make a gain, that kind of thing.
Well, I
She's a
think
vineyard flipper.
And she's also an exerciser. She girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. She knows how to stay fit and healthy and productive.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, like we said, the overall theme is kind of kindness and selflessness. And, you know, I think what we're describing here is a woman in general, not a woman who is married yet. And, you know, because it's talking about finding a virtuous woman.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to start describing what a virtuous woman looks like, which I think carries over into marriage. But I think, you know, that she's first describing...
This is the goal of saying this is the kind of woman you want when you're seeking a wife.
Yeah.
This is what you should be looking for.
And so, I mean, some things that I wanted to point out as well was each of these little parts kind of emphasizes an aspect of this woman's character. Like, the first being obviously kindness, says she will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. You know, this is someone who is kind and gentle, kind-hearted, sweet. She seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. She's skilled. She has abilities. She's not just useless. You know?
Well, if you go back and look in the Bible characteristics, I don't know where this trend came in society that women were somehow to be uneducated and stupid and timid. Because if you look in the Bible, you know, the women, okay, so she wasn't out there cutting trees down, you know, building a house. She was working within her abilities
She had to.
to provide for the family, you know, to take care of their needs. She took care of making sure everybody was warm and well clothed.
And they drew water from wells and stuff, and
Yeah.
they did all kinds of stuff.
And women in that society were not passive doormats, you know.
Yeah. I think mostly
past
it's
the day,
just it's
probably.
the idea of old English kind of terminology that makes it sound like women were just property. And I mean, there's a certain aspect of that that's true for that time period, but not in the, not in the sense that everybody thinks of it in this weird oppressive way. Verse 14 says she's like the merchant's ships. She brings her food from afar. I don't know exactly whether that would mean she's like thrifty, or whether she's just always looking for
Bargain.
bargain, unique thing. Yeah, like she's bringing.
Opportunities.
Yeah, she brings her food from afar. Like she figures out where the best deals are, and she goes and gets them. She rises also while it is yet night, and gives meat to her household and a portion to her maidens. She's hard working. And then, like Dowd is bringing out there, she considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. Not only does that also denote that she's a hard worker, but it has aspects of wisdom and business smarts.
Right.
That she's not unwise to what a good piece of property is.
Well,
She's
even
educated.
it
She
seems
knows,
like
yeah.
even though
She knows gardening. She knows.
even though her husband is probably working to provide for them, she's not just sitting home, let's say, and just waiting.
She's not a China doll.
With a
Yeah.
woman like this, you don't need to be a working husband.
Yeah, she's like in the yard
stay at home like
planting and waking up early, making food, probably making food for him as well, so he can go to work and all.
Yeah.
Fed.
Yeah, she's doing her part.
Yeah.
But like I said, they're working together for the same goal, for the overall good of the household.
Yeah.
He may be taking care of of a business of some sort. He could be herding cattle and sheep or whatever they did in that day. He was tending to a bigger business model. She was doing the smaller business model, but it was all things that joined together,
Yeah.
provided for the well-being of everyone.
And
She was educated enough to know if an opportunity came by that maybe her husband wasn't aware of, she could take the initiative to go ahead and see that it was a good opportunity and go ahead and run with it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, so she's wise and she knows what she's doing. 17 there, and I did find this verse kind of interesting when I read it. It was that what Dad said, that she girds her loins with strength and strengtheneth her arms. Not only does I think that comes back to hard working, but it does sound like somebody who works out.
That is true. It sounds like it.
Like she's
Or
not.
but
she
maybe
realizes the
she's-
importance.
Yeah, maybe
of
she's getting strong
activity.
from doing all the work.
Sure. Well, I think another aspect also, what kind of comes to my mind is the image of what we call a farm girl.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't
Isn't afraid of manual labor.
Yeah, she gets her hands dirty. Like it's somebody who goes out and deals with
Changes
the
the
animals.
oil in the car.
Yeah, whatever they got to do.
Changes the valve cover gaskets on the car. Changes the starter. And
Yeah, I did the alternator belt once.
Alternator.
Yeah, I mean, but she girds her loins with strength and strengthens her arms. It's kind of fascinating.
Of course, does that go with bearing arms too?
Strengtheneth her arms. But it also paints a picture of a woman who is not
Docile.
Yeah, who's not some weak,
Helpless.
fragile
Yeah.
little being. She's independent. She's smart.
Scott says the virtuous woman complements and fulfills her role as a suitable helpmeet, as God originally ordained at creation.
Yeah, because I mean, as a helpmeet, God didn't create Eve as this weak being
No, you had to
for
be.
Adam to take care of.
Yeah.
Originally the roles would have been so much simpler without sin. So what would you have done? Just help husband pick up the tree or whatever, whatever you gotta do.
Exactly right.
So I think that women aren't supposed to be as weak as society makes them out to be. They are created weaker.
We are created physically weaker in terms of physical strength,
Yeah.
but there is an emotional strength that women bring to the equation.
Oh, great! Here we go. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
You know, and I was
Well, the
telling-
emotional strength in terms of that tenderness, because a man left to his own devices often becomes very cool, analytical, calculating. And there's nothing wrong with that in the business world.
Yeah.
But when it comes to having children to raise, it requires not only the man's perspective, but it requires the tenderness and thoughtfulness and sometimes the intuition of a woman. A lot of times a woman will pick up on things with body language, tone of voice that a man will completely miss.
Well, obviously. That's why women are always mad at us, right?
No, I mean, I'm just talking
What do
in
you mean
terms
by
of,
that?
I'm talking in terms of kids. You know, there were times when I knew my kids were up to something. I knew because their behavior shifted, their tone of voice changed. They did something they didn't or normally do. I was so in tune with the routine of the way they did things, I could almost anticipate where their minds were going. And like everybody says, you know, the one thing that a mother knows is to go looking if it gets quiet in a house with toddlers. You know when they get quiet, you're in
What are
trouble.
they
They're
getting
into
into?
something because
Yeah.
they're so focused, they're not making any noise. And I don't think that men are wired to pick up on all those
It
things.
gets quiet and we go, finally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, I just think instead of
That's true.
fussing about our differences, we should be celebrating our
Mhm.
differences, because those differences put together make a whole package. And if you had one, if both are the same, one of you is unnecessary. You know, if you can do everything and be like these single women that are having to raise families.
I can do it all. I'm
Yeah.
super mom.
The women that raise families and have to be the breadwinner and raise families know that there is a sacrifice that they're making. And the sacrifice is usually the kids, because the kids don't get that time and attention and training from mom.
Yeah.
They're left more to their own devices, and they often get into trouble because there's no one there to supervise them, and when she's there, she's too tired. So, you know, it takes both husband and wife. It really does need both people. And so these people that are out there that think that we should have these, you know, single parent homes, and that there's no problem with single parent homes, they just need to look at our society and see. You know, there are kids that are just roaming the streets because nobody is there to care about them. And they get into trouble, and then pretty soon you've got an entire society at risk because of large numbers of kids. You know, when I think the worst thing that happened in our society was when World War II happened and the women began to work in the factories. And when the husbands came home, the women continued to work, and they got used to that nice double income and all the material things they could get. And now the kids were having to be raised by someone else.
Yeah, and then we had, I think the change was really noticeable, particularly for that next generation of kids who grew up and started the hippie generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, basically a bunch of wealthy kids living off of trust funds who, chose to opt out of society and squander away any wealth their parents had worked really hard for. But, I mean, how different would it possibly have been if they had a good family model at home? You know?
Scott says her virtuosity excels as her husband cherishes her, just as the husband is supported likewise by the respect she shows to him. One complements the other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, going on from there, verse 18. She perceives that her merchandise is good. Her candle goes not out by night.
That's a,
She works long hours.
She thinks ahead.
Well, that's especially true of a mother, right? Candle goes not out by night.
Never ends.
I always got my best work done after 10 o'clock when the kids were in bed. It was the
Yeah.
only time I could work uninterrupted. And I got into the habit of basically doing my work from 10 at night till about 12 or 1 in the morning.
Absolutely. And so she works long hours. She lays her.
This other thing about her merchandise is good. She's looking to see that if she's making something to sell, she's checking to make sure it's a good quality. but apparently she's also checking that the things she buys are a good quality. So, you know, there's a real art in being a mother who transmits those qualities to her daughter. You know, my kids grew up with I don't think any of our girls have a problem with shopping for their kids' clothes in a thrift store, because they learned early on that there's a glut of clothing out there that has barely been worn, and why should you go out and pay 2 or 3 times that amount for the same thing that you can buy in a thrift store? You know, because practical people know that kids wear things out. They outgrow them. And so most of the time their stuff isn't worn out, it's just outgrown. And so, you know, those are the kind of things that mothers can teach by example and by teaching. So this thing of teaching about merchandise, teaching how to evaluate things, how to evaluate whether the produce that you buy, teaching your kids how to pick good fruits and vegetables, how to look at these, how to pick a good watermelon. I would love for someone to teach me that skill. Because every time I just don't have the training. I never had anybody show me those things.
I usually pick good watermelon.
That was just a silly example, but I'm saying
Yeah.
the value of a mother being in the home to teach the kids is huge. To think that somehow she can do that job that would take all day in most societies and cram that into whatever evening time she has left after working a job somewhere, you always know that the kids are the ones that pay that price. They don't get the time and attention that they need. They don't get any training because everybody's too tired.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes at the cost of your family and the next generation. I think I'd heard somebody mention this as well, is that so kids, they'll pick up on everything that you do, and good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we have a generation of such horrible parents, is because the generation before them either didn't show them or showed them a horrible example of parenting as well.
And it's like a chain that once you get that chain weakened in this direction, everything after it is weakened.
Yeah, and it just continues down the line, and I've noticed that as well. Is the kids who come into some of our programs and stuff, you can tell a lot about the parenting that goes into some of them based on the kids that come in.
The way they react to challenges.
The way they react, the way they behave, you can just tell how they are parented most of the time.
Or not parented.
Or how they are not parented. And then you can meet the parent later and already have a pretty good picture in your mind of what that parent must look like in terms of how they parent their kids. And it's a really sad state. But I mean, the cycle kind of continues even with stuff like us, Some parents have brought their kids in because they're like, we just need them to have good examples in their life. And it's like, well, what are you? Like, who are they hanging out with all the time that, that you need to bring them into someone else's program and say, you be a father to this child? Yeah.
Well, the expression that was always used with public education was the Latin phrase in loco parentis, in place of the parent. That's what the school was. And I don't think most people recognized what a double-edged sword that was. Because if you look at communism, in communism, the children don't belong to the parents, they belong to the state. And the state takes the responsibility for educating them. Here in the United States, the same thing happened because the public education process, which originally was taking place in the church, all the original schools in the United States, when they established schools, were usually done in the churches because the church was only used once a week and the building could be used weekdays for a school. So that was how you began to have these schoolrooms. Well, as they consolidated, education became turned over to the local government, and ultimately we ended up with the head of the public education system, the founder of it, was John Dewey, who was president of the American Humanist Society. His purpose was to eradicate Christianity through education. He wanted to get rid of it. I'd say he did a really good job of it, because if you look at what's come out of public education, it could not be more godless and self-serving and man focused. So you
Yeah.
have a whole society
Yes.
that has now been changed and influenced by that. Scott
Yeah.
says, at the heart of a well-oiled family machine is a godly woman. The husband is the covering and the head, but the wife is the heart of the home.
And she's not afraid of snow. Verse 21.
Yeah. Well, Elsa's got that one down. She's not afraid of snow.
Just that
She
one?
prays for it every winter.
Well, yeah, so I mean, so I guess she lays her hands to the spindle and her hands hold the distaff, I think is just implying the skillfulness.
Mhm.
And I guess the earlier passage about seeking wool and flax is just her industrious
Well, seeking
side.
wool and flax, and then she weaves it into fabric to
garments
make
or
clothing.
whatever.
Right.
That was what everybody did back then. You know, they didn't have a fabric store where you could go down and pick out a pattern and buy a roll of fabric and sew something together.
Like, now you gotta go buy your own wool and flax, and you gotta put it on the spindle, and you gotta reel it out, and then put it together, and do the slidey board thing. But yeah, it's
And you can make your patterns and your colors, and depending on how interested you were in making something attractive, you know.
She has compassion for not just her family, but it extends beyond that.
yeah.
to,
She stretches out her hand to the poor. Yeah, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. So she is compassionate and, I suppose, generous.
Mm-hmm.
And she's not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet.
Costly materials.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not even scarlet necessarily being costly. I think the implication is
High
that
quality.
scarlet had to do with not with the color, I think, as we think of it, but I think it was the color of a warm garment made with wool.
Mm-hmm.
That it would implied that she had something that she prepared for a cold season as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it kind of goes down a very natural progression leading up to that point of she's got the material, she puts it into something, they're clothed for the winter. You know,
Right.
she thinks ahead, I think is the big point too. You know, she's looking to the future because obviously you don't get to winter and go, oh, shoot, you know, I better start getting on those coats for everybody. You know, it shows somebody who thinks ahead. She makes herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple.
So she has a good self-image about herself.
Yeah, she's well dressed.
She wants to look good for her family, for her husband.
Absolutely.
Which means she cares about her appearance.
Cares about her appearance.
Naturally. Yeah, so she's looking out for herself, for others, for family. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. And of course, you know, that kind of brings it back to the idea of the context of this is specifically, more specifically anyways, you know, written to a future king. Right? And so the expectation is like, here's the kind of wife a king should have. You know, because, and I think that's why the image is set so high, is because the expectation would have been so high as well.
I think too that this has to do with reputation, because you know we don't talk a lot about reputation in today's society. We're so fragmented. We don't have that sense of community that existed in other societies, where you know if something happened in the home, a lot of times the whole community knew about it. Somebody died, somebody had a baby, somebody's kid was in trouble, something was going on, somebody was sick. Those kind of things went through the whole community. Everybody knew about it. And so the husband, when he was one of the elders in the gate, that means that he had a position of respect, that they knew he had a good family or a good reputation.
Absolutely.
That she was part of providing that good reputation.
It's probably also in Proverbs, but I forgot exactly where it is. It talks about basically along those lines that like a wife that praises her husband or something like that, or is of good report, shall be praised or blessed or something like that. Exactly where that is, I'll have to look into that. But it's that same idea that like, you know, you want to be with someone who enhances your reputation, not somebody who, you know, is contrary to your reputation, which is almost completely contrary-wise to we think of the relationship between Hosea and Gomer, right?
But that was a specific
that was
command.
a specific command. It was a different situation. But I mean, it's just kind of interesting to find that example. She makes fine linen and sells it, and delivers girdles unto the merchant. You put,
We all talk about girdles today, don't we?
is a girdle like a loincloth or like a belt?
It could be translated either way.
It's basically underwear.
But in our generation growing up, a girdle was something that a woman would wear to hold her stomach in.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
so
of course.
We had a great time talking about this when I was in my teens. You know, she makes fine linen and sells it and delivers girdles. It was one of the.
And the merchant's like, I don't need no girdle.
It's translated here as sashes.
Yeah.
In this translation.
Right. So these were, probably something
Sarnas.
beautiful that people would wear as to tie up their robe or whatever. But even that in a society was important because it was functional, but it apparently was attractive as well.
Also, because you probably had just like pretty much a blanket, like with a hole for your head to go through for the dresses and stuff.
Yeah. Well, making fine linen means that it's a strong belt. It wasn't just something flimsy.
Absolutely. Verse 25, strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come.
So it shows some optimism. She's optimistic about the future.
Absolutely. But it also speaks to her character as well. And that, I think also that idea of forethought, that the things that she invests in her character now are things that will become more important later. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. I find that phrase to be very interesting and kind of beautiful at the same time. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. So, any other thoughts on those last passages there?
No, I was outside. Yeah.
It kind of, I think it's almost summarizing the points that it's bringing out about her
Right.
as it's coming together. I think the idea that in her tongue is the law of kindness is very important, because I think one of the most common temptations that a lot of women in the world fall into is the temptation of gossip. And, men will go and will hit each other in the face, and women will just say things quietly and they use words to hurt instead of physical force.
True.
And so I think it's just an aspect of the feminine character that in her tongue is the law of kindness. She doesn't speak ill of people, doesn't partake in gossip and things like that.
Yeah, and of course that's really a difficult thing because women, at least in our generations, they grow up with a tremendous competition mindset, and the way to, as you're competing for male attention or whatever, the best way to gain an advantage is to put somebody else down, to lower the people around you to try to exalt yourself. And so that's why you have a lot of that words being used and attitude.
And women naturally use more words than men do.
Yeah.
All the men.
Who was it, Gary Smalley? When we were watching his series on marriage, he said that a man uses about 25,000 words a day, and a woman is closer to 50,000. And he said that's why when the husband comes home from work, he's already used up his allotment. He just wants quiet. She's just getting started.
She's warming up.
And she wants to talk when he gets home, and
Yeah.
he just wants a quiet thing. And it's important to understand that difference is there, and to give him some cool down time before you put in your barrage of words.
Yeah, or I think it was Joyce Myers maybe. Sermon I'd heard from her a while back was she was talking about how one of the things that Esther did before she sat the king down and brought the important issues to him was she fed him. And she said that she always felt like that was an important point to bringing up important discussions, was you make sure that he's not hungry,
had a good meal,
that he's
not
happy,
tired.
and then you're like, cool. So now to the serious stuff. You know? Now that you're fed and everything's good, we've had our drinks.
So if you come home and the meal is on the table, it's a really good meal, look out.
Yeah, all right. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I just thought that was an interestingly wise point, because I can't think of many men who wouldn't, after having enjoyed a really good meal, be like okay to discuss, because at that point, yeah, you're kind of disarmed and you're kind of like content, and
Well, the blood is down there trying to process the
Yeah.
food.
So
The
you
brain,
can't be
so
up
the
here
brain
angry.
can't
Be up
fight.
here.
Yeah,
Is that where we get the
I mean,
toes
that's the
buttering up?
physiology behind it, right?
Maybe.
That's the physiology behind it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and we could also, I mean, look at personal examples too. But I feel like this pretty well covers the idea of the things that people should be shooting for, and I think tying it all together, more than this describing just a godly and virtuous woman, I think it honestly describes the characteristics of Christ, and I think maybe even the church, if you want to look at it from that perspective. Especially kind of the interesting points which I figure Dad would have
Certainly
probably
his
brought
bride.
out.
If you're taking that analogy a little further, describing characteristics of his bride,
Yeah. Yeah, I
the
mean,
church.
His people, what his church should be doing.
yeah. I heard a great sermon where somebody said the church is not the place you go, it's the people who go. And I thought that was a really brilliant way of
We
looking
don't go
at
to
it.
church, we are the church.
So collectively,
Yeah, but I liked the way he said it more, because saying that still puts it in the idea that like just meeting together is the thing that kind of makes the church group, when really the point that he was making is the church is the group that is going out and trying to do the Lord's work. And it's not just like, he's like, getting together wasn't a problem, and he said it's
Getting
great.
together sounds almost like a selfish focus.
Yeah,
And it is important that we get together for fellowship and encouragement.
yeah.
But it's also important that we also have an outreach in mind, that we
And that-
emphasize the outreach and sharing.
And that's pretty much what he was saying, is that like when you look at when God established the church, let's say, it was when he told the disciples to go and make other disciples. And he said the commandment wasn't to go and find a building and buy it and be there and be your own group.
Get your big multimedia group together and get your worship team and your praise team, and
Yeah, I mean,
when you've raised a couple of $1 million, then you have a church.
Yeah, mega church. So, but I thought that was a really important distinction, was that idea of action being the church, and not just a place or a group, but a people who are mobile.
I've always called it organic Christianity. That, our outreach should be as natural as breathing. That we should be looking for ways to do things that bless other people. Not necessarily a way to assault somebody with our Christian beliefs, but a way to reach them where they are, where their need is. You can't go and just meet somebody on the street like some of these street preachers do and give them a barrage of, you should do this and here's what the Bible says. You're only going to touch the lives of a couple of people with that approach.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny. Well, I'll mention that story after, because it was kind of funny in town. But just in ending those last couple of verses there, because there were some other interesting things I wanted to bring out as well. Is not only the bigger implication of this being the bride of Christ, and the idea, and another reason it sounded so interesting was for her household they are clothed with scarlet. I thought that was a very clear connection to the idea
Covering.
of a covering of
blood.
of blood, that she covers her household in scarlet, which means, you guys know that. Anyways, but that was kind of interesting.
Or that she looks after the spiritual well-being of her family as well as the physical well-being.
And one of the last couple of verses there, what kind of interesting too, is that her children arise up and call her blessed. her husband also, and he prays with her. And you know, that idea of praising her for all the wonderful things that she does, being her support and helping her do that, but also that her kids wake up, and I almost pictured it almost more being like a case where, like, we would wake up in the morning and maybe come downstairs and find you and be like, we love you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it might be the first thing we do that day. And
You were like that as a little boy.
yeah, I don't know if anybody else was, but I mean, I almost think of that as being the, like, that's almost what I picture when it talks about her kids rising up and calling her blessed.
Well, there's an affection that exists between a mother and child, and that foundation of having that relationship first thing in the morning, you get the hug from mom.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important thing. That's a security that you are offering to your children, of knowing that you have someone who loves you, someone who's there, who's got your back, who's interested in what's happening with you, and someone at the end of your day who listens to how your day's gone, what you've been doing. Those are the heartbeat things that a mother does, or that a mother should be trying to do, that you don't realize you are influencing the whole future generations by being there, where it may seem like, okay, you know, if I stay here in the home, I'm not earning an income. That's not the same, that's not saying that your role is unimportant or not worth doing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, the other point of that I think was interesting as well was I almost think of it in terms of like how people tell other people about you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, about your kids and your husband praising you. Is that it doesn't necessarily have to denote that they are going up to her and being like, hey, you know.
Timmy's here to visit.
But I guess on that note, we're a little over anyways, so.
Yeah, I told him about 1:15 we would be done, and
Alright, well, we'll
he
go
wanted
ahead.
to bring the grandbaby over for us to enjoy today.
Aw.
She doesn't like Timmy at all.
We'll go ahead and pray and
You may want
visit with
to
everybody.
keep her quiet.
Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath and this time that you've allowed us to be together. We ask that you help us to be more like these things that you've described. Help us to be more like your Son. Be with us now for the rest of the Sabbath day. Help us to enjoy the family meal together and to enjoy the company of friends and family. This we ask and pray in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen.
And on that note, I guess we will see everybody next Sabbath. And don't know what we're going to talk about. I guess we'll see if someone wants to take it a different direction, or I mean, there's more in that direction to talk about. But
Are you going to be back with us next week since you're going up to camp?
I should be back here, but whether I'll have time to
Okay.
study out through,
We'll
we can
plan
kind of chat
something for
about
next
it.
week.
So
Yeah, no, I'll figure something out then.
But-
We hadn't talked about it before.
yeah, it's fine.
All right. See you next week.
See you next week.